Okay, kiddos, it's time to talk about what's happening with Japan in the period from 1750 to about 1900. So the last time that we talked about Japan, we were discussing their transition from a feudal society into a centralized government under the leadership of the Tokugawa shoguns. So that feudal structure had been displaced by these unified shoguns who were ruling in the name of the emperor, and they were able to, using early Western and weapons, able to dominate the other daimyos or landowners. That meant then that samurai were no longer needed in their original capacity, so they oftentimes became bureaucrats, worked within the government and things like that. So the Tokugawa shogunate really was able to, again, create that centralization, and for quite some time they created thriving internal trade, and things were pretty good. However, by the time you get to the early 1800s, there are a whole bunch of different issues like crop failures. They start to have to charge higher taxes in order to maintain the government. They also are dealing with the rising price of rice, which meant that especially the peasants started to protest and rebel. And the Japanese, just like the Chinese, had adopted a closed country policy as a result of the first contacts with European exploration that took place in the 1500s and the 1600s. So as foreign countries that have industrialized have realized that they're able to come into China and force the Chinese to sign unequal treaties, there start to be requests by like the British, the French, the US that are requesting a right of entry into Japan, and ideally what they want to do then is trade with the Japanese. And the Japanese have no interest in that. They say, we are going to continue with this closed policy, please stay away. But the one thing that we know is different now is that the countries that are coming in and requesting this access have industrialized and have industrialized weapons, whereas the Japanese don't. That all changes when Commodore Matthew Perry from the United States comes into Tokyo Bay in 1853. So he brings in the U.S. fleet and starts to demand entry there. And the Japanese can't say no because they don't have any sort of military force to back up their desires there. And the Japanese are forced to accept an unequal treaty with the United States. And it's called the Treaty of Kanagawa, and it's very similar to the types of treaties we saw that the Chinese were forced to sign with other westernized nations. Once the United States has forced the Japanese to sign an unequal treaty, other westernized nations realize, hey, we can do the same thing. And then you start to see within the Japanese society, some people are like, well, if we're going to get rid of these foreigners and kick out their economic dominance within our country, we're going to have to be able to compete with them. And being able to compete with them meant we need to modernize. And you saw that it was really a lot of the young samurai class that thought that was the best way to get out of the unequal treaties, was to become like a Western nation themselves. So the Tokugawa rule really ends, or it's like final nail in the coffin, is these humiliations that they've suffered at the hands of the Western nations. So because the shoguns are started to be seen as weak and unable to maintain the Japanese identity, there ends up being a lot of opposition to the shogun's rule, especially out in provincial areas. And there were some other dissidents or people who were unhappy with the way things were working who started to think, well, what if we got rid of that position of shogun, technically a military leader who rules with the permission of the emperor? What if we established a new type of government and way of society and gave power back to the emperor? And that leads us into the Meiji Restoration. So the Meiji Restoration is officially implemented in 1868, and while it's technically viewed as being done in the name of the emperor, it's really reformers who are using the emperor's name, if you will, or position to implement the changes that they want. So under the Tokugawas, you saw that the shoguns were acting in the name of the emperor. These reformers are kind of doing the same thing as well. But the Meiji emperor, who you can see on the right-hand side there, is used as a justification or a way to bring in these Western ideas and kind of convince the Japanese population that this is what's best for people. So the emperor's name is Mizuhito. And he is known as the Meiji Emperor because that means enlightened, and that's, again, adopting some Western ideas there. So he retains his authority, which wasn't really a ton. I mean, we've talked before about how the Japanese have had only one dynasty throughout their entire history, because very rarely do the emperors of that dynasty actually have the political power. So when there were upsets within the government and whatever else, it was the people who were actually in control who were overthrown, and the dynastic powers were left in place. So when the Meiji Emperor is then reinstated as, the leader of the government, that really ends almost 7 centuries of military rule in Japan, from what we had seen with the daimyo and the Tokugawa and so on and so forth. So with the Meiji Restoration, there are a whole bunch of different reforms that are implemented within the country. Some of those reforms included inviting in foreigners and their expertise when it came to weaponry, military strategy. There was an adoption of Western education styles. There was a large study into the different written documents that governed the Western nations that had industrialized, because you typically saw that those countries that had westernized were leaning towards a more democratic sort of way of doing things. So, for example, with the Japanese government, and I'll show you more about this in a second, they decide that they're going to get rid of the old feudal order. They decide they're going to get rid of the old organization of the government there. And what they do is they create a constitutional government that's based on the German model of the Constitution. And the reason they do that is that the German Constitution, it did grant a legislative body to the people, but in essence, the German emperor maintained control there. So in the constitution in Japan, it's given as the gift from the emperor to the people in 1889. And so the emperor, he remains the supreme leader, and it limited the rights of people, but they do give the right to vote. Now, that sounds better than it actually was, because there's only about 5% of the adult males that met the voting qualifications. The imperial legislature was called the Imperial Diet, and it was really this opportunity for people to debate and express their dissent for certain ideas. But again, it's possible for the emperor to overrule any of the decisions that are made within that diet. And so it's kind of democratic, kind of not. But again, it's not military rule anymore, and this is in the name of the actual emperor at the time. You saw that there was a revamping of the tax system within Japan. So they converted grain taxes. Instead of paying with physical grain, you would pay with a fixed money tax. That meant then that there was a more reliable and stable income for the government, so they knew what they could build, what they could spend money on. And there was also a new way that they looked at how taxes should be measured. Taxes were measured based on how productive the land could be. So if you decided to work your land more than what the government estimated its productivity was, that's great. You only had to pay taxes on what they thought you could produce. If you produced less than what the government thought you could do, you were still responsible for the tax amount that they believed that you should pay them. So that was an interesting way to make sure that they had enough of a government revenue coming in. Other things, when I said that they had abandoned the feudal order, the daimyo and the samurai lost any special privileges and status that they had previously had. There were new district lines, like provinces drawn throughout Japan so that it would break up the old feudal dominions. And then now, instead of having regional samurai, there was the creation of a new national army. So these other Western countries had standing armies for quite some time, and this is what Japan does as well. They also, in 1781, when they officially banned the feudal system, they free the peasants. And the peasants had really not been able to leave their land, but now they're able to own land. They're able to try to improve their own station in life. And a lot of them start to improve their own standard of living by improving the farming techniques that they've been using for hundreds of years, and they're able to grow more food and, again, therefore better themselves. So Japan embarks on this whole transition. Their education is based on the West. Their government's based on the West. They import Western weapons, all of these things. But what they do want to make sure is that they retain a Japanese identity. So while their new slogan is "Rich Country, Strong Army," they are using a Japanese-style currency called the yen. They are trying to maintain what makes them unique as Japanese. While they're doing that, though, they're again still changing as much as they can so that they become industrialized in competition, if you will, to the West. So they build railroads just like the West does. They build up the postal system. They build telegraph lines. They invest in steamships. Those schools that we had talked about with adapting a Western education, they make it so that there's universal primary and secondary education, and that means that that's elementary school and kind of like middle school, high school for everyone. They create universities and they make them competitive, which is actually something you still see in Japanese society today. There was this stress that Japan was superior within the world, meaning their culture, their way of life, their way of doing things was better. And that's actually going to play a role in what happens with World War I and World War II a little bit later, but we'll keep that in mind. They also were very much into promoting industry. So one of the things that you saw with this promotion of industry was the creation of something that we call the zaibatsu. And the zaibatsu were these businesses that the government started, and then they would sell the private enterprises to their supporters or to their friends. So they end up being like these huge family-owned businesses that make like this very like unique financial clique of people with at the very top levels of society. So it would be run by like the entire extended families. And you saw that women kind of created alliances where they had done that politically previously. Now you have different zaibatsu families having their women intermarry to create alliances economically. So like Mitsubishi today is an example of one of those. The cost of developing all of this economically was something that the Japanese people paid for through their taxes. So I had mentioned before that the tax yield was based on what your land was able to produce. So it cost the peasants about 40% of their income, and that made up about 90% of the state revenues. The peasants, any sort of rebellion that was detected by the government was immediately squashed, because remember that the government's main goal now is to industrialize rapidly. And if you have revolts taking place, that means they can't focus on that, and that means they can't get rid of the Western powers that had forced them to sign that Treaty of Kanagawa and other unequal treaties as well. So the Meiji rulers and reformers very much so crush any sort of labor movement. So they outlaw unions, they don't allow strikes. Anybody that participates in those is seen as a criminal. And Japan then is able to become an industrial power in a single generation. On a side note, if you can hear my cat meowing in the background, it's because he wants treats and I won't give them to him. Back to school. So by the time you get to 1899, they'd ended all of their unequal treaties. And then what they're able to do is pretty cool too. They're able to, not only in the Second Sino-Japanese War, but in the Russo-Japanese War that takes place in 1904, the Japanese completely destroy the Russian Navy. They were fighting over areas on the mainland that Russia had traditionally been in control of. And when the Japanese get into this fight, the Russians had taken their naval fleet all the way from the Balkan Sea, and they traveled all the way around Africa through the Indian Ocean and up to Japan, and they think they're going to kick the Japanese butts, and the Japanese flatten them in like one battle. So that really reveals or is indicative of how the Russians were completely unable to industrialize in a way that allowed them to be competitive in the modern world, whereas the Japanese did. This is just a slide that explains to you how the political system worked under the Meiji Constitution. And so you can see through the different lines there, especially the dotted ones, those are like implied controls, kind of like checks and balances, I guess. But the emperor still is at the very top of control there and has the most power. And then just overall, if you think about what happens with Japan now, the Japanese, once they industrialize, see themselves as the equals of other industrialized nations. The Western countries that are white do not think that. They still think of the Japanese as an inferior culture, whatever else. But since the Western European countries that had industrialized focused on creating empires, that's what the Japanese start to do. And you can see in the map there that their original empire is, along those Japanese islands. But by the time you get to 1910, they had taken over Korea, Taiwan, part of the islands to the north that had belonged to Russia, and then that sphere of influence area in Manchuria is what they had won during the Russo-Japanese War. So the Japanese are very much on this trajectory to be super competitive in the Western world. And when we talk about World War I, they actually fight on the Allied side of the Western European countries and then kind of get screwed over during the Paris peace talks, which is why in World War II, they fight with the Axis powers of Germany and Italy. So again, we're pressing pause, on the story of history of what's going on there. But of all the societies at a crossroads that we've looked at, Japan is the only successful one because they are modernizing and industrializing across industries. It's coming from the government and they do everything possible to allow for this industrial success. They start businesses and sell them, that being the zaibatsu. And the Japanese also have the unique advantage of only having or of having a very homogeneous culture, meaning that there's not a lot of diversity there, so that's not something that they're trying to overcome at the same time. So again, we'll use this whole era of imperialism to kind of explain their role in World War I in our next unit.